Hi guys, welcome to this video where I talk about forecasting. In this video, I'll do a basic introduction of forecasting, give you some background of what forecasting is, how it is used in real life industry and whatnot, and we'll get started on some of the very basic ideas in forecasting. The rest we will do when I see you in class. All right. So what is forecasting? Again, this is something that you might have seen in other classes or might have even this is something that might have been touched upon in other classes, but we will do a little bit more in forecasting right here. That's fine. All right. So we'll talk about what is forecasting, the strategic importance of forecasting, the seven steps in the forecasting system, and the different forecasting approaches, right? So we'll talk about time series forecasting, associative forecasting, monitoring, controlling forecasting, and forecasting in the service sector. So these are all the quantitative things that we'll do, but let's begin with some of the basics, right? So forecasting is used in a continuous basis in many different industries. I like the example of the Hard Rock Cafe that I always like to give. It's actually from the textbook. The Hard Rock Cafe uses different sorts of forecasting for different parts of their business. And there's actually a very interesting video about how they use some of the very simple techniques that we talk about in very powerful ways, right? So Disney is an example. So we'll understand the idea of the three different time horizons for forecasting and why which models apply for which ones will apply. We'll understand the different the idea of qualitative models and quantitative models, the different kinds of simple qualitative models, and then we'll look at some seasonal indices and some more involved quantitative models, right? And that's the idea here. So what is forecasting? So forecasting is the art of predicting future events, right? And this is very important in any industry, and especially for operations managers. Figuring out forecasting is very important because all schedules, all production schedules, inventory schedules, personal and facility schedules, which are all usually things that are controlled by operations managers, are based purely off of forecasting numbers, because you need to know what you expect to happen in the future so you can make plans for what you want to do in the future, right? Now, the different types of forecasting, we'll get to that in a second. So there are three different time horizons on which you do forecasting. One is very short range forecast. This is what are you going to do in the next week? What are you going to do in the next month? What are you going to do in the next couple of months? So, or maybe up to a year. So these are all short range forecasts. And when you use mathematical and quantitative techniques, most of the time the forecasts that you get out of short range forecasts tend to be fairly accurate, but there's always going to be error. The farther you go in the future, the more the error, the higher the error is going to be. Having said that, unless there are big disruptions in the market, the forecast that you have for the next couple of months or next 3 months tend to be decently accurate, right? The medium range forecast is anywhere from a month, 3 months to 3 years, as I say, a year to 3 years. Now, this is useful for long range production planning, some cash budgeting for any capital budgeting that you have to do. If you have to build a new plant or acquire another company or something like that, you need to have longer range forecast, because you need to know, hey, I don't have enough capacity to take on everything that I have, so I might have to outsource part of my business, or I might have to acquire somebody else or build a new plant. All of these things are based off of medium range forecast. And of course, you have longer range forecast where you're doing further out into the future, where you're doing grand capital expenditures, research and development, and all of that. So all of those are based off of long range forecast, right? So each of these different forecasts is used for different things. Short range forecast for immediate operational things. Who are you going to hire? How many people are going to show up? What kind of shifts are they going to have? All of those are going to be based off of short range forecast, and medium and long range forecast for more higher level sort of analyses. All right. So medium and long range forecasts deal with more comprehensive issues, while short range forecasts deal with immediate issues, and they tend to employ different types of forecasting methodologies, right? And short range forecasts, like I said, tend to be more accurate than long range forecasts, right? Now, companies have to do three different types of forecasts, right? And these are very important types of forecasts that you have to keep track of. And I'll not go in the same order as you see in the slide here. Technology forecast is something that companies have to do. They have to predict the range of technological progress, what kind of new products are going to come up, are there going to be new services offered by either you or maybe your competitor that's going to completely change the industry. And I mean, there are many examples of this. When the PCs first came out, it completely changed the mainframe industry. Nobody knew exactly how much people were going to like having computers in their house to do simple things like budgeting or playing games or things like that, right? Or when the iPhone first came out, right? Before the iPhone, there were smartphones, but the smartphones were much harder to use. The one smartphone that most people tended to use were Blackberries. That too, mostly business people. Regular people tended to use flip phones. But once Apple introduced the iPhone, and then Google came up with Android, within a span of I would say 2 to 3 years, right? The cell phone industry completely changed. People went from having just flip phones to having smartphones in their hands. So this not just changed the computer industry, it changed a lot of other industries. For example, Salesforce.com and what we call Salesforce right now used to be called Salesforce.com. The reason for that was it was a website. And the way it worked is that if you had traveling salespeople who went to different companies to sell your products or to talk to clients, what they would do is they would all have connections to 3G networks back in the day. They would log in to their website and say, "Hey, I'm going into to the client's location now." They're going to log in, and once they come out, they'd go back into Salesforce.com, log in, and then type up a report of exactly what happened immediately right after having a customer interaction. Now, this completely redefined how salespeople worked in the past, because back in the day, you'd meet with 10 different clients, come back, and then you'd have to write reports and figure out what happened for 10 different clients. But now you could go to a client, finish something, immediately upload a client report, so you have things fresh in your mind. Right? So Salesforce.com itself changed everything. But once the iPhones came out, Salesforce was one of the first companies to develop apps on cell phones. So now not only could you keep track of when a salesperson is going in and out of client office, you know exactly where they are because you have access to their GPS. So that changed the way everything's happened. So you didn't have to explicitly log in. You could have your app on and then just walk into your client's location, and the server would know that you had walked into the client location. So technological progress tends to have huge impacts on the way companies work, and especially if companies have technology integrated into them, it can have a big difference. Now, it also has huge differences in manufacturing industry. So there was this few years ago, there was a company that redesigned the way robotic arm lifts work. Their redesign was so much more efficient that the older robotic arms that were used to lift crates and stack crates were about 60% slower than they were before. And so companies that were able to install the new robotic arm were able to manage their inventories in their warehouses at a much faster rate and make more bang for their buck, essentially, right? So technological forecasts are very important, and companies always have to keep track of that. Apart from technological forecasts, you also have economic forecasts. These are really long-term forecasts where you're looking at how the general business environment is. I mean, are we in an inflationary period? Are we in a recessionary period, right? Are there going to be any bubbles that are going to burst? Is there a credit bubble? Is there a housing bubble, right? So these are things that companies have to keep track of, because even if, let's say that there's a company that makes cars, for them the housing bubble is important, because remember back in 2007 when the housing bubble burst, and some of you might not, but during the 2007 recession, the biggest thing that happened was because of credit default swaps, the housing bubble burst. There was a housing bubble, it burst, but what the main thing that came out of that was that credit was much harder to get. And because of that, the Fed essentially reduced its rates to zeros to make sure that so that it was pumping more money into the economy. But that was a extreme decision that the Fed had to take. So things like that happen, and they happen because of these economic cycles, right? So keeping track of economic cycles and how things are moving is very important. And some companies do that, but some companies their whole job is to keep track of these economic cycles. There are research institutes out there, there are companies out there which track economic cycles and then sell this intelligence to other companies so that they can use that intelligence to understand how things are happening. So S&P does this, Dow Jones does this, right? All of these big players in the data industry, they do it, right? And so, so economic forecast. So that's a second type of forecast. The third type of forecast, and the ones that we are going to talk about in this class, are demand forecasts, right? So demand forecasts are where you predict the sales of products and services, right? And products and services, and you usually keep track of, so again, the medium-term forecast, the short-term forecast, medium-term forecast, and the long-term forecast that we talked about apply to all three types of forecasts. But the ones that we are going to mainly talk about are demand forecasts. So we're going to look at what kind of sales did you have in the past, how can you use that data to make predictions in the future. We'll look at some qualitative methods, and we'll look at some quantitative methods of how these forecasts can be done. Right. So, but what is the strategic importance of forecast? Like I talked about before, it's important for all the supply chain activities, everything starting from good supplier relations to knowing what your market is going to be, what your product is going to sell like, how quickly is it going to sell, how quickly are you going to replenish, a lot of supply chain decisions, hiring, firing of workers, hiring new workers, training new workers, giving them training on new technologies, all of that human resource stuff, and of course capacity, right? How much capacity do you have? Can you handle all the customer demand? Will you be able to, will you have enough demand for your products and all of that? So all of those important decisions are made out of the forecasting numbers, right? So how does forecasting work, right? So there are 7 steps that you usually do when talking about forecasting. First you decide what you're going to use the forecast for. Then you select the items that are going to be forecasted. Then you determine a time horizon. It's going to be short, medium, or long. And also sometimes when you're doing quantitative forecasting, you need to know the exact time. Are we talking about weeks? Are we talking about months? Are we talking about days, right? Then you select the forecasting model that you want to use. Then you gather the data to make the forecast, and validate and implement the results. The validation is very important. We'll spend a fair bit of time on validation. We'll do this in class, but we'll spend a fair bit of time on validation. But remember that validation is always useful because you are making predictions about something that's happening in the future. So you know a priori, before anything happens, that your guess is going to be wrong. You're not going to predict exactly what's going to happen. Question is, how close is your guess to reality, right? So that's something we need to keep track of, right? So most forecasting techniques will assume that there is some stability in the system. There is some pattern that exists that you're able to capture. There might be some randomness. You have to account for a little bit of randomness, but for the most part, you're assuming that there's some sort of pattern and you're able to access that pattern. That's what most of the forecasting techniques assume, right? The other important thing is that in reality, when you aggregate forecasts are always better and more accurate than individual forecasts. What does this mean? Forecasting for, say, for example, if Apple is forecasting for how many iPhones they're going to sell, right? Now, if they do an individual forecast for, okay, how many iPhone Pro Maxes with 2 terabyte hard drive am I going to sell? So if you look at that particular forecast values, right? So look at the way Apple forecasts those numbers and look at what happened in reality. You calculate any errors that you had in forecast and you compare that to an aggregated forecast, which is how many iPhones is Apple going to sell? All iPhones, all different models put together. So if you aggregate all the numbers into a single number and you forecast for that single number, the aggregated forecast will always be more accurate than the forecast for those individual products, right? And this is true for reality, and this is true for because the way distributions work and so on, right? One other thing, and this COVID and the pandemic has definitely taught us, is that you cannot always predict what's going to happen, and there might be something that completely can wreak havoc on the forecast that you come up with. Things like the COVID-19 pandemic or the bubble burst in the Great Recession in 2007, 2008, some political upheaval, regime change. All of these things can have huge impact. So there was a tsunami in back in the day, which affected a nuclear reactor in Japan. And that had a huge effect on the industry in Japan because a lot of exports were stopped out of Japan for a very long time. So things like that can have huge impacts, and that you cannot predict, right? So when you're making predictions with this, that's why we always say that short-term forecasts are more accurate than long-term forecasts, because these unpredictable events are more likely to happen in the long term than in the short term. Right? So there are two major forecasting approaches: qualitative forecasting and quantitative forecasting. I'll go over qualitative forecasting in this video. Quantitative forecast I'll do when we see each other in class next time. Right? So what is qualitative forecasting? So qualitative forecasting is when the situation is vague and very little data exists. This is usually true for new products or new technologies. And this sometimes involves emotions, intuition, personal experiences, some value systems, sometimes input from multiple people, right? And of course, you have quantitative methods that are based purely on numbers, right? So this can be used when you have a lot of data. You can use this for existing product and existing technologies. You use mathematical techniques and you figure out how to forecast sales and demand, right? So there are four major qualitative methods that people use, right? One is the jury of executive opinion. So you pool opinions of high-level experts and managers and ask them what they think they're going to sell. And this is actually a very common technique that is used. If there are multiple stakeholders, each stakeholder might use quantitative statistical models to come up with some forecast, but then people sit together and they talk to each other and they decide, hey, this is the number that we expect our demand or sales are going to be for the next month, right? So you get together, but in the end, the final decision was made not based upon statistical models, but by talking to each other. So non-mathematical considerations might go into making these decisions, right? So that's a jury of executive opinion. The Delphi method is similar. You have a panel of 5 to 10 experts who are queried iteratively. Now, sometimes in this method, decisions are made not just purely based on numbers, but also on other realities. Now, Delphi method is used by, say, Alaska has oil reserves outside the state. And they have a certain quota of how many barrels of oil they're going to extract. So this forecast of how many barrels of oil is extracted is done by a panel of experts. And the way they do that is they use the Delphi method for that, right? So where each panel comes up with a number, they have a reason for why. Now, based upon their political reasonings, some of them might want a lot of oil extracted, some of them might not want a lot of oil extracted. Then they come back, they sit down, they talk to each other, and they finally have a final number, which is potentially somewhere in between. And that's how the forecast is done, where it is not based purely on the numbers, but also on other considerations. The Salesforce composite is again very similar to the jury of executive opinion Delphi method, where you have individual salespeople who come up with their own forecasts, and that might again be using quantitative methods, and then you sort of aggregate the forecast together, right? And then you come up with a final forecast again, which might involve quantitative methods. Now, individual Salesforce people, they might have used their own methods, or they might have used qualitative methods themselves, like gut feeling. Okay, I know that my clients will buy a certain amount of paper, or my clients are going to buy a certain amount of my product because I have good relations with them. I have a good idea of what's going to happen. So some of it might be based upon numbers, some of it might be based upon gut feeling, but in the end you compile them all together and you aggregate that and you come up with a forecast number. And final is market survey, when you have absolutely no idea about the product that you're going to sell. It's a brand new product, a brand new kind of product. Nobody has sold anything like that before. How do you know how much to make? What your forecast? How many units your customers are going to buy, for example? Then you do market survey. You go talk to people about their future purchasing plans, similar products they've purchased, or if they would be offered such a would they buy it? A lot of different questions go into market survey, but you could do a market survey to figure out what's going to happen, right? And so these are the main qualitative methods that you have when you do forecasting. Now the quantitative methods, so I'll briefly touch upon them. We'll do the actual methods when I come in class, but okay. the quantitative method. So there are two major groups of quantitative methods. You have time series models and you have associative models. So time series models are models that are based on time series data. Time series data are data which are collected at equal intervals of time. And again, we will talk more about this when I see you in class. There are different approaches with time series models. With associative model, linear regression is the major approach. But again, I'll talk more about this when I see you in class. So I'm going to end this video here. It's already 20 minutes long. This was an introduction to forecasting. What is forecasting? What are the different types of forecasting? And yeah, so I'm going to end this video here and I will see you all in class next time. All right. Take care.